I think it's all the more important now with the changing dynamic with folks going in and out of office buildings. It's not the same Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 customer in that seat. We need to provide service that meets their demands. And so, that midday service becomes all the more important if we're going to attract riders.
I'm excited today to be with Mike Noland. Mike is president and general manager at the South Shore Line, the Northern Indiana Commuter Transportation District in Indiana, and he's also chair of the United States Commuter Rail Coalition. Mike, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have this. Our mutual friend Marcelo Bravo connected us. I appreciate him doing that. Mike, tell me some about what you do.
I am the president and general manager of the passenger operation known as the South Shore Line. And we're a 90-mile commuter railroad that operates between the South Bend International Airport and Millennium Station in downtown Chicago. We've been in existence since 1908. And so we're 115 years or so old. And we're proud to serve the residents here in Northwest Indiana.
And your background is you have a long background in rail. I mean, you were 21 years at Metro, right?
Actually, 28 years at Metro. Started off in HR and wound up as in law and as general counsel, and then as the deputy executive director. And then from there, I went into the private sector rail industry, and I worked for a short line freight holding company. Also did a little bit of passenger rail. And then in 2014, the South Shore Line through and their parent is the Northern Indiana Commuter Transportation District, reached out and said, our general manager is retiring. Would you consider coming over here and interview for the job? And the rest is history.
There's so much to talk about when it comes to commuter rail. And for those who don't know, Metra is the big Chicago commuter rail system. Are they the largest in the country?
It depends on who's measuring and what you're using to measure for maybe distance. They're certainly up in the top 3 with Metro North and Long Island. So
right. That's what I thought. Let's talk about your operation in specific, and then we'll open up a little bit to what's happening in the nation as commuter rails are kind of adapting to a new 3-day city that's happening in a lot. Is that happening in your area as well, where people are using commuter rail more in the middle of the week?
Yes, somewhat. We're a little unique, and I'll get into that in a minute, Paul. And we do operate on Jim Derwinski's system in Chicago.
Okay.
So, of our 90-mile route, 75 miles is either owned, mostly owned, all dispatched, all maintained, all capital projects are done by us. We then get to Chicago at 115th Street in Kensington, and we jump on Jim Derwinski's Metro Electric system for the last 14 and a half miles of our ride. Today, we are running 39 trains every weekday and 21 trains on weekends in and out of Chicago. Pre-pandemic, we were running about 3.5 million rides a year. We're right now at about 50% of that level, which roughly for our industries puts us right in the middle. There's some of us who are, lower in the 30% range, and there's others, specifically Metro North, I know has reported that at times they're at 70% or greater. As a whole, our industry is right around 50%. We have seen our numbers as an industry steadily climbing, inching back up. As you mentioned, the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday phenomenon where the collars of Monday and Friday are weaker. We've seen that as an industry trend. It's a little different here on the South Shore. We've always had a fair amount of discretionary riders, being a 90-mile corridor. We're 2 railroads in one. Our service from South Bend is the 90-mile route, and that's more of an inner city kind of service. Whereas as you get closer in from our Michigan City, and especially from Chesterton, Indiana, Ogden Dunes, Gary, East Chicago, Hammond, that's more of your typical commuter service. Our discretionary traveler, the farther out traveler, has been pretty robust. They're coming back quicker. And so we're still seeing good numbers on Fridays and on weekends, but we are still, we're still struggling at the 50% level, although growing slowly as employers make that decision on who should come back to the office and how many days of the week. are they coming back? That's the big question. Where will that level out is I think what we're trying to understand.
Right. If I were to get on at South Bend and ride into Chicago, the full 90 miles, how much would I pay?
You'd pay $14 a one-way ticket.
Wow. I couldn't even drive it for that price.
Yeah, and a lot of it's toll road, and then you get parking issues in Chicago. And so we're a good bargain. We are looking at fare structure as many of us are in trying to entice people come back to our trains. Not many of us have increased fares because of the headwinds with ridership to keep up. So that's an issue that we're all facing, a challenge. Right. Yeah, I'll agree with you. It's a great bargain at $14 a ride. Yeah.
Now, South Bend, isn't that where Mayor Pete, who's currently Secretary of Transportation's from?
You got that right.
Wow.
Mayor Pete and I worked very closely for a number of years on a major infrastructure project that he strongly supported. He now obviously is Secretary Pete, heading up the DOT in Washington. But he's always been a big proponent of commuter rail. He saw, as he called it, his phrase was, connectivity is the new currency. And he wanted greater connectivity between South Bend and Chicago. So not only the discretionary traveler, but the business community that would move people back and forth between business campuses between South Bend and Chicago. So huge advocate of commuter and passenger rail. So work very closely with Secretary Buttigieg.
You mentioned, not raising fares because of the impact it could have on ridership. Let's talk about the funding of your agency itself. How do you get your money and how much do fares cover, those kind of things?
Yeah, I mean, pre-pandemic, we were right around the 50% fare box recovery mark. We'd ebb and flow above and below that, but that was always our target. The balance of our fares come from a variety of sources. We get a portion of sales tax directly from the state of Indiana. We certainly had some marketing and leasing revenue that came in. We are able to utilize FTA Section 5307 on some of our maintenance activities, which lowers our operating expense. So all in all, it's a mixture of state and local revenues. In addition, as I mentioned, I run on Jim Derwinski's railroad in Chicago, right, but I also am a contract carrier of Metras. So I pick up passengers in the state of Illinois, and for that, Metra compensates me to provide that service. So that's another source of revenue for us as well.
A lot of commuter rails operate with their own employees, but many also contract out with companies like Keolis, Transdev, others. Is that right?
Yeah, but we directly run and operate and employ the folks who run our railroad. We do not have a third-party contractor who's running service for us. Certainly aware of that model. You might look at it from the standpoint of Metra hires us as a service carrier to provide their service along our line in Illinois. We directly employ the folks who run our railroad.
Gotcha. Have you adjusted routes? The frequency and those kind of things. Talk to us about how you've done that based on what the current ridership patterns are. You're hauling about 50% of the passengers. Are you still running the same frequency, or have you reduced and then raised it on weekends to meet new demand there? Or talk to us about that.
Okay, so that's a perfect transition into the fact that we're embarked on a 2-year, $650 million double tracking project over a 26-mile corridor on our system.
Wow.
That will open up huge opportunities to increase frequency, improve on-time performance, and drive time to market down to the central business district down significantly. And so we made the decision not to do any changes. Essentially, we shut down our line between Gary, Indiana, and Michigan City, that 26-mile corridor, and we're executing a bus bridge so that the contractor has a greenfield site in order to complete those improvements. So right now, you get on the train in South Bend, you take the train to Michigan City, you get off at Michigan City, you get on a bus. The bus then picks up the 4 or 5 station passengers between Michigan City and Gary, drops people off at Gary, they get back on the train in Gary, they go to Chicago, and then they repeat that on the way back.
How much time does that add to their trip?
It probably adds 10 to 15 minutes for the people that are in the bus bridge geography.
Okay.
And so we made the decision that we're not going to tinker with schedules at this point in time until we get through with the project. And the project is about 80% complete now. We'll open up for new revenue service next May. And at that point, we are rolling out a brand new schedule with significantly improved service, both, as I mentioned, better intervals between Indiana and Chicago, as well as 14 additional trains. And that kind of pivots to something we've talked about, which is looking at what the new rider wants and looking at service opportunities. One of the reasons we did the project is we had gaps in our midday schedule. And that we always saw as a headwind or a challenge to growing our service. I think it's all the more important now with the changing dynamic with folks going in and out of office buildings. It's not the same Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 customer in that seat. We need to provide service that meets their demands. And so, that midday service becomes all the more important if we're going to attract riders.
So talk to us about what double tracking is for people who aren't familiar with it and how that will help.
So from Gary, Indiana, all the way into Chicago, from Gary to where we get on the metro system, about 30 miles, we have a double track railroad so that if something happens on one track, we have crossovers. Think of those as passing lanes, and we can move a train over to the opposite track, go around an issue or a slower train, and then come back to the one track that we were on. It gives us tremendous flexibility. So from that point, from Gary to where we get on metro, it's double track. And then Jim Derwinski's got a quadruple track railroad. So it's a wonderful network, and it's all grade separated there. From Gary, for the next 26 miles between Gary and Michigan City, we're mostly on single track railroad. So I kind of describe it for the folks that don't understand that environment as when you're on a 2-lane highway in a construction project and they're doing construction work and the flagger puts out his stop sign. Well, the traffic from the other end goes. And then when all that traffic clears, the flagger turns it around and lets you go the other direction. That's our environment on a day-to-day basis over this 26-mile corridor. So in the morning, when we send our fleet into Chicago, it's kind of like a parade. Everybody follows the leader. And if anything happens, everybody behind the leader slows down. It takes a delay. And everybody coming from the opposite direction has to wait until all that traffic clears to go the other direction. So we really can't run a express type service or limited type service other than the first train in the morning. With double track, we'll be able to run significantly improved skip stop or limited service. We can have a local train, we can have an express train, and they both can be occupying the two tracks that we're now building. And in addition to that, the flexibility from a scheduling standpoint, if we have an issue, if there's a mechanical issue or there's a tree on the obstruction on the track, or we have a overhead wire issue on one track, we're not stopped. We have another track that we can operate on. So tremendous flexibility for us. I should mention that we're also, in addition to the double track project, we're building a 8-mile extension off our main line. So I've got we're expanding. So the state of Indiana has pushed all into commuter rail. So where there may be headwinds in the industry, we're bullish here in the state of Indiana, and we're a pretty conservative state. We're not necessarily known as, promoting transit for transit's sake. They're doing it because they see an economic return on investment. That's a message that we need to continue to get out to those who are our supporters as we work in Congress to preserve our funding.
Who owns the tracks?
We do. South Shore Line, back in 1990, this railroad was being operated by a private sector railroad. That railroad went bankrupt. With help from the state and the federal government, we purchased the line, the asset, and we now own and maintain the line. We have a freight tenant who operates on us. And then, as I mentioned, when we get into Chicago, for the last 15 miles of our 90-mile route, we have a trackage rights agreement with Metro. We need to provide, as an industry, and we are looking to do that, better off-peak service because our clusters in the peak periods that we used to rely on, 6 to 9 in the morning and 4 to 7 at night, are changing. And, there are individuals that may be going to the office 3 days a week, but they're not necessarily there from 8 to 5. They're there for maybe core hours, and then they're jumping on a train, or if we're not providing them a good service, they're getting back in their car and driving back home, and then they're on a Zoom call or on a Teams meeting. And so it's our belief that, especially for us, our new service offerings next May are going to position us really well for the changing business climate that we need to service as this industry evolves.
And are you, talk to us about the electric trains versus diesel and how you are powered there.
Well, we have 1,500 volt overhead DC power, which matches up with the system that Metro uses in Chicago. We then convert that power to AC for our propulsion system. And that's been our operation since, I want to say 1925 or so. The city of Chicago required that on the lakefront, the railroads electrified. So that's been the footprint and the requirement to get into Chicago. So that's what we followed for the last 100 years or so.
That's amazing. And so maybe let's branch out a little bit to the industry now and talk about some of the challenges the industry is facing, because you are chair of the Commuter Rail Coalition. First off, tell us what the Commuter Rail Coalition is and how many commuter rail members you have across the country, et cetera.
We're saying there's 31 commuter rail properties now in existence in the country. I think we're well over 20. I think we're getting close to 23 or 24 of those properties that are members, as well as our Marcelo's one of our supporters from industry, business and industry that provides services to the commuter rail industry. And from a ridership standpoint, from an overall percentage of riders, I think our members transport 95% of all commuter rail riders in the country. We'd love to see 100% of commuter rails in the country join us. We're really a singular focused entity. We are advocates for commuter rail. That's all we do. That's our 100% focus. We're driven to support initiatives, whether they be legislative or otherwise, to support growth in and success of commuter rail in this country.
What are your ideas on the way commuter rails can help bring people back?
First of all, as I mentioned, and as we're rolling out, better midday service.
Okay.
We need to provide really good service off of those peaks so that the business rider has a reason not to drive their car into the central business district. Here in Chicago, we just got the designation as being the most congested highway system in the country, second most congested in the world. That there are people coming in and out of downtown Chicago. That's low-hanging fruit for us. We need to figure out how to get them out of their vehicles and make it attractive to them to get on our trains. So things like Wi-Fi on our trains, good schedules in the midday, other amenities. We have to figure out what is attractive to the folks that are currently deciding to go in a couple days a week. How do we get them out of their cars and onto our system? And one of the things is we needed to promote the fact that we're 18 times safer. It's 18 times safer to be on our trains than it is to be on the highway driving your car. Or said conversely, you're 18 times more likely to be in an accident driving your car than you would be on our trains. So
wow.
We're safe, we're efficient. We need to be more responsive from a schedule standpoint. And I think that's where our industry is headed. Be more responsive. We need to look at ways to bring the time down to market. All those opportunities to invest in our systems. So, reliability, comfort, safety, all those things are important to our rider. One of
the, I have a friend that runs the Metrolink service in Toronto. One of the cool things that they've done there, I'm sure you've heard about it, is they have a deal with a local grocery chain called Loblaws. And when commuters ride in the train into the city, they can order their groceries online. they're sent a code, and then when they ride the train back to the station, there's refrigerated lockers there, and their groceries have been delivered to the locker. They enter in the code, and that way they don't have to stop at the grocery store on the way home. I really think those kind of extra amenities are another great way to encourage people. You've got the safety, you've got the cost factor. I mean, you couldn't park in Chicago for the price of your train ride into the city, So those kind of things, like you said, I think make the case for us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we need to get in the mindset of why is someone driving? And part of it is that individual freedom. And it's I want to go when I want to go, and I want to leave when I want to leave.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about increased frequencies in the midday, so that that person looks at it and says, oh, well, yeah, I know I have that freedom, but wow, there's a lot of train service. And so now I can decide I've got the freedom to leave and get the train and not have to, endure the traffic. And my God, there's Wi-Fi, so I can connect up, and maybe I can listen into that Teams meeting, and be as productive during the workday,
yes,
and not skip a beat. It's a changed working environment, and we need to change with it.
Let's talk a little bit about, if you care to speak on a little bit, one of the big issues that I continue to hear around the country is the dearth of high-speed rail. Why can't we get high-speed rail? We've got a couple private lines that are higher speed, Brightline trains in Florida. I know our train sets used to go like 131 miles per hour, but that's nowhere near the maglev trains in Japan and Europe, et cetera. What's going on with high-speed rail in America, Mike?
Well, if you want to anoint me supreme commander of the world, the simple fix is that the rails become just like the interstate highway system. And that's how they do it over in Europe. In England, the rail bed is owned by the country, and access is granted to that rail system. And there's a priority given to passenger rail. And they weave into their network, that rail network, the freight traffic that's essential as well. As you know, that's not how it is here. Everybody,
so it's the opposite here.
It's the opposite here. Everybody owns their own right of way, and nobody wants to be at a competitive disadvantage in the freight rail industry. And I'm sure they'll all say, and I've heard them say, that they support passenger rail, but unless you had, in my opinion, unless you had that kind of system where it was an open network like our interstate highway system, it's an incredible challenge to implement high-speed rail, and that's one hurdle. The other hurdle is, and this has just been my observation, whenever somebody wants high-speed rail, everybody along the line wants a stop. I always joke that if Southwest Airlines operated that way and they were flying to Denver, they take off out of Midway Airport, they go 30 miles, and they land in Aurora, and they go another 15 miles, and they land in St. Charles, and then another 15 miles. They would just keep going, stopping along the way. High-speed rail has to run over long distances to be effective, and so that's a fundamental decision that has to be made. And the communities along the line have to realize that if you want it to be effective, you need to build a Chicago to Detroit corridor, or Chicago to St. Louis, and run it all the way, just like the airlines do. But again, I'm a commuter rail guy, so I'm not here to fix the high speed rail problem.
Well, then let's. But that's great. I really appreciate that. That's good feedback on there. I agree. So talk to us about what's happening in the industry writ large right now of commuter rail.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an issue with our funding. Many of us have talked about the fiscal cliff that we all face. We all tremendously benefited by the relief acts, CARES Act,
right,
and the other acts that kept us running during the height of the pandemic. And we have the ability, because of good sound management and resource planning, to continue to run for several years, but left uncorrected because of the loss of ridership, we've got many of us have a giant hole in our budget. I've seen that New York has solved their fiscal cliff, it seems like, with some additional state funding. I think there's a proposal in California, at least in the Bay Area, through some tolls. we're all looking at trying to plug that gap that the lost ridership is causing. So not only are we at, so we're at 50% ridership. Okay, we've got capacity on our trains, but that also means from a fare box recovery standpoint, we're nowhere near that 50% recovery standpoint, and we've got a hole in our budget. And at some point in time, that has to get solved. So many of us are talking locally to our funding providers, whether it be our general assemblies or our local entities or a combination of both, to figure out a way to provide a funding source to keep us going. Because in addition to, even though we're at 50%, we provide significant economic return, even at 50% to the local communities that we support. There is a wonderful economic throw that we bring. And I know here in Northwest Indiana, we've done studies that the folks who ride our train going to Chicago earn a 40% wage premium because they get higher wages in Chicago than they do out here in Northwest Indiana. So we're an economic engine. We need to find ways to bring people back to the train, but we also need to solve that fiscal cliff here in the short term. I believe it's a short-term problem. I'm a glass half empty or half full person. I believe we are going to bring people back and we're going to figure it out. But I do believe it's going to take a couple of years before that all levels out.
What else? What other thoughts do you have here as we close up?
We got a great infrastructure bill. Paul, I've been in this industry a long time. I think either one of us has seen the kind of infrastructure money that's available, and not only the state of good repair increase that we've seen, but also the competitive grants and the money that's available for commuter and passenger rails, unlike anything I've ever seen before. We need to leverage that, and we need to invest it in our systems, and we need to analyze ways where we've got bottlenecks or we have areas where we can improve our service. And I'll tell you this, that it's not just going from 79 miles to 90. It's where you've got 25 mile speed limits and you can go to 50. It's the places where you've got the lower speeds where you can, by a civil improvement, increase those significantly, is where we gain time. And time is really what our riders value. So
yes,
that's what I think our industry needs to focus on: preserving our dollars, making sure that when there's an opportunity for legislation that either promotes us or protects us, that we take advantage of it and be ready. And then, I'm bullish. I am. This is a great industry, and I see nothing but great things in the future.
Thank you so much, Mike Noland, for being our guest today on Transit Unplugged and for kind of painting a path forward for other commuter rail agencies, the 31 here in the U.S. and all those around the world, of attracting new passengers and providing better service for them. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bob, for having me.
Hi, this is Mike Bismeyer, and this is Mike's Minute, where we talk about mentorship, leadership, and kindness with the hopes it'll inspire you to pay it forward. Well, it was great hearing Mike Noland's discussion with Paul, the climb and rise from HR to legal to deputy executive director and then eventually GM. Again, showing opportunity is abundant in our industry. What a fascinating call it was, in hearing the in-depth knowledge of passenger patterns, adapting to the daily struggles of our industry, and pivoting that agencies do daily. Where I'm going with all this? Well, the transit conference season is heating up. And with the many fall shows ahead of us that we will all be attending, including the large Apt to Transform conference, it's a perfect interview to hear that reiterates the incredible knowledge and peer sharing that is part of our industry. I always say that it's amazing the learning and the transit education that's available for free at every conference. The panels, the sessions, the meetings, and the peer networking. It's exciting to look forward to. This was another great example of mentorship in action. Just the way Mike eloquently talked to state revenues, subsidies, local and state policy, contracted services, scheduling challenges, and adaptations that agencies go through, reiterates that we should be listening to our peers. And your kindness challenge for this week is to make sure that with all the upcoming travel in the fall, you take time to thank someone who is part of your travel journey. Whether it's airline, hotel, or restaurant staff, just make their day. Have a great day. Thanks for listening. Kindness is cool.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Transit Unplugged with our special guest, Mike Noland, President and General Manager of the South Shore Line in Northwestern Indiana. Now, coming up next week on the show, we have Diana Kotler, CEO of the Anaheim Transit Network. We'll learn how she helps people who live and visit the happiest place on earth get around the city. And while you're listening, if you could take a moment to rate and review Transit Unplugged wherever you listen to podcasts, we'd really appreciate it. Rating and reviewing helps other people find the show and become part of our transit community. If you have a question, comment, or would like to be a guest on the show, feel free to email us anytime at info@transitunplugged.com. Transit Unplugged is brought to you by Modaxo. At Modaxo, we're passionate about moving the world's people. And at Transit Unplugged, we're passionate about telling those stories. So until next week, ride safe and ride happy.